Dorothy Jane Scott was a 32-year-old woman who lived in Stanton, California. She lived with her aunt, who she was close with, and her son, 4-year-old Sean. As a single mother, Dorothy worked hard as a secretary to provide for her son. When she wasn't at work, she was at home. She was known as an extreme homebody and a devout Christian. Everything changed when one day she received a call at work. The call was strange, but she brushed it off at first as a prank. But the calls kept coming. After many of these calls, one day the man told her to go outside because he had something for her. Frustrated with the ongoing harassment and beginning to get scared, Dorothy went outside to see if she could catch a glimpse of the mysterious man, but there was no sign of him. What she did find was a single dead rose on the windshield of her car. Hey humans, it's Hannah. Welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, I do videos on creepy and disturbing things. And today's video is the September Patreon poll pick. Each month I give my patrons a poll with a few choices, so they get to decide one of the videos for that month. And Dorothy Jane Scott's story was the winner. If you're interested in being a channel member and becoming one of my patrons, the link is in the description down below because there's way more perks on there than just polls. Okay, back to Dorothy's story. So like we established, Dorothy worked as a secretary. She worked at 2 different Anaheim stores, but they were jointly owned. One was called the Swingers Psych Shop, and this place sold items like lava lamps and love beads, things like that. The other was called Custom John's Head Shop, which sold paraphernalia for smoking tobacco and cannabis, so pipes and bongs and things like that. In spite of working at these shops, Dorothy did not partake in anything that they sold. She didn't do any drugs. She didn't even drink alcohol. And like we established before, she was an extremely religious person known as a homebody. These mysterious calls would start months before she would eventually go missing. The calls would be different each time. Sometimes the caller would fawn over Dorothy and tell her how much he loved her and admired her and just poured all his love out to her over the phone. And then other times the calls would be of threatening violence or severe resentment towards her. He would then ramp up the creepiness factor by 1,000,000 when he would describe to Dorothy her daily routines, just to prove to her that he really did know everything about her and was constantly watching her. So there was that dead rose occasion call that we talked about, but that wasn't even the worst one. On one of the subsequent calls, he threatened, and I quote, "Okay, now you're going to come my way. And when I get you alone, I will cut you up into bits so no one will ever find you." And Dorothy would tell people that she kind of recognized the voice, but she just, for the life of her, could not place it. So this would tell us that it was probably maybe an acquaintance that she had met once or twice, so she kind of vaguely recognizes it but can't place it because they're not familiar enough. Or perhaps it was a stranger that she had a very short interaction with and they interpreted something very different. Dorothy's parents lived in the area and they would very frequently watch 4-year-old Sean while Dorothy went to work. They would say later that Dorothy absolutely had no steady or consistent boyfriend. The only thing they knew is that it was possible that maybe she was dating here or there, but absolutely nothing serious if that was the case. The calls did, of course, scare Dorothy a lot. They scared her so much that she did consider at one point buying a handgun for her own protection. But she changed her mind on that decision because her son was so little, she was too scared about having a gun in the house with him. She did start taking some karate classes because of her fear of this man, but she only started them a week before she went missing, so she didn't have a lot of time to really gain any self-defense skills, and who knows if it would have actually helped her in the end. So Dorothy goes missing, and the circumstances around her disappearance are almost weirder than the phone calls. At 9 p.m. on May 28th, 1980, Dorothy is at a staff meeting. However, in the middle of the meeting, she would leave with her coworker, Pam Head. They would leave with another coworker, Conrad Bostron. Conrad clearly did not look well. He looked really sick, and then he had this big red streak mark on his arm, and the girls were super worried about him, so they offered to drive him to the ER. So they left the staff meeting to help Conrad. They didn't go straight to the ER. The three of them stopped at Dorothy's parents' house to check on her son. It's important to note that Dorothy also changed her black scarf for a red scarf, and I believe she did this just because the red scarf was warmer. So they took Conrad to the ER, and it's not super relevant to the story, but it did turn out Conrad had a black widow spider bite, so it is good that he went. But while he was being treated in the emergency room, Pam Head, the coworker, and Dorothy waited for Conrad in the waiting room. Pam would later swear up and down that Dorothy did not leave her side the entire time that Conrad was back there. Conrad gets discharged from the ER at around 11 p.m. Since he was really not feeling well and was super weak still, Dorothy offered to go get the car and drive it around to the exit so that Pam could escort him to the car and he wouldn't have to walk super far. Dorothy goes to use the restroom before she gets the car, and that would be the first time she was separated from Pam the whole night. Dorothy then headed to the parking lot to go drive the car around. Pam and Conrad stayed behind. They got Conrad's prescription to treat his spider bite, and then they went out to the exit to wait for Dorothy to bring the car. But Dorothy didn't show up. They waited a few minutes and she wasn't there. So Conrad and Pam went to the parking lot to see if they could find her car. And they did, kind of. Like, suddenly Dorothy's car sped at high speed towards them with the high beams on. They were so bright that neither of them could catch who was behind the wheel or see if there was somebody in the car with Dorothy. So the car then sped past them and like ripped out of the parking lot. So Pam and Conrad are like taken aback and shocked, but they give Dorothy the benefit of the doubt, thinking maybe she got word of something that happened with her son that was another emergency, so she rushed home to go check on her son. Conrad and Pam wait at the hospital, hoping that maybe Dorothy will come back for them. She doesn't. They wait there actually for several hours. They finally called Dorothy's parents to ask if she was there with Sean and them. And the parents said that they hadn't seen Dorothy all night either. So now panic ensues and Pam and Conrad call the authorities. At 4:30 a.m. the next morning, so just a few hours after this all went down, Dorothy's white 1973 Toyota station wagon was found on fire in an alleyway about 10 miles from the hospital. No one was nearby and nobody was in the car. This is the only sign of Dorothy they would get for several years. On June 12th, 1980, so just a couple weeks after this happens, an unidentified man called the front desk of the Orange County Register, which is a local newspaper that ran a story about Dorothy just that morning. The caller told them, quote, "I killed her. I killed Dorothy Scott. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I killed her." The caller knew about a lot of details the night that Dorothy went missing. He knew about Conrad's spider bite. He knew that Dorothy was wearing a red scarf. These details hadn't been published, so this did lead them to believe that perhaps this really was somebody involved in her disappearance. The caller even claimed that Dorothy called him that night from the hospital. But Pam, of course, denies this and says it's not possible because she was with Dorothy the entire night that they were there. But regardless, this was as close to a motive that we ever got. And even though, like we established earlier, Dorothy wasn't dating anybody, not seriously, so she couldn't be cheating on somebody else. So we also know that this caller was clearly very delusional about his relationship with Dorothy. Unfortunately, even though they didn't find Dorothy Scott's body right away, the calls would continue to her parents now. About a week after she disappeared, her parents then started to receive the phone calls, presumably from the same man who had been harassing Dorothy. The first one, he just said, "Are you related to Dorothy Scott?" And when Mom replied yes, he said, "I've got her," and then he would hang up. He would continue to call the parents almost every single Wednesday afternoon. He would either tell them that he had Dorothy in his possession or that he killed her. Just full-on tormenting and harassing this family that had already been through so much. So in April of 1984, which, if you can do math, is about 4 years after she went missing, The man called the home, but it was later than usual, and so Jacob Scott actually answered the phone, who was Dorothy's dad. Usually it was Vera who answered the phone and he would talk to her, but when Jacob picked up and told the caller he had the wrong number, he hung up and the caller didn't call them again for several months. It is believed that either this anonymous caller thought that since Jacob answered and he didn't recognize the voice, that maybe the family had moved away. Or others believe that it's because whoever was stalking Dorothy actually knew her dad and somehow met Dorothy through her dad. And so when he recognized Jacob's voice, he got spooked, afraid that Jacob would recognize him. A few months after this incident, on August 6th, 1984, Dorothy's remains would finally be found. A construction worker would find her bones on the side of the Santa Ana Canyon Road in Anaheim. A bushfire had swept across that area a couple years ago, and since the bones were partially charred, it is thought that they had been there for the last couple of years. There were also some dog bones with her bones. There was a turquoise ring and a watch were also found. The watch had stopped at midnight on May 29th, which would have been about an hour after she had been abducted. Dorothy's skull, though, was amongst these remains, and so they were able to identify her with her dental records. At least they could confirm that it was Dorothy and that she had passed away, but unfortunately it had been too long and they couldn't determine a cause of death. Jacob and Vera, though, were finally able to lay their daughter to rest on August 22nd. It was at least a small amount of closure for them, but unfortunately, after this happened, the calls resumed. The police put a voice recorder in their house, but nobody was able to recognize the voice. They also put a tracker in their phones, of course, to see if they could trace the call, but the caller would never stay on the line long enough for them to successfully trace it. And when these calls continued, they didn't change. Like, the caller kept just saying the same things. He would just tell them that he killed Dorothy, or he really liked to say, "Is Dorothy there?" And then he would just say, "I've got her." As for suspects, I mean, this case is still a complete mystery and unsolved to this day. There's been no solid leads or suspects. They did, of course, check out Sean's father, or Dorothy's past partner, but he lived in Missouri and it was confirmed that he was in Missouri the night that she disappeared, so he was ruled out. And I know I've said this several times, but Dorothy was known to be a homebody, so if she wasn't at work, she was at home. Everyone would describe her like this, and almost to the point where her life was like boring because she didn't go anywhere. She did not work with customers at the shop. She worked in the back as a secretary. So it was highly unlikely that one of the customers that frequented the shops was doing this to her. And like we said before, she wasn't dating anybody seriously, so it could not have been anybody that close to her. It must have been somebody who misinterpreted an interaction with her and thought that they were then in love with her and they became obsessed and awful, or it was just somebody that she kind of knew that was watching her from afar. This leads me to speculate that perhaps it was a coworker that was hiding in plain sight. That would explain how he would know so much about her. This coworker would have known that Dorothy was going to the hospital that night. I mean, was this person at the staff meeting? Did he wait for the staff meeting to be over and then drive to the hospital to watch Dorothy from afar? And then he went to go wait at her car to abduct her, knowing Pam and Conrad were there too, flash the lights in their eyes on purpose so that they couldn't see him? Or perhaps Dorothy was driving and he had hidden in her back seat, threatening her with a weapon to make her drive them away so that he wouldn't be spotted at all. Or was it in fact one of her father's friends or acquaintances? If he stopped calling after he heard Jacob's voice, maybe he did get spooked and afraid that Jacob would somehow recognize him. This would also explain how he might know and become obsessed with Dorothy. The closest thing they ever got to a real suspect was a man named Mike Butler. Mike Butler was actually the brother of one of Dorothy's coworkers. He also worked nearby Dorothy and his sister, so this would make it extra easy for him to stalk her and know things about her. Those that knew both of them did say that Mike had an unhealthy obsession with Dorothy. Mike also happened to be obsessed with the occult, and because there were dog bones found by her bones, it's sometimes rumored that maybe the killer was sacrificing them, or that it had something to do with the occult or Satanism or something like that. But there is no solid evidence to prove that this was the case. All there is this really vague speculation with no evidence, not even really circumstantial evidence for around him. And I mean, for all we know, maybe Mike was just some weird, awkward dude that had a really fat crush on Dorothy, so he would like talk about her a little too much to his sister and her friends and everything. And he could be completely innocent in all this. We don't know, but there's just nothing solid to connect him, or there's just not that one thing that's just like, oh, he totally did it. You know what I mean? Like, nobody saw him at the hospital or anything like that. Like, there's not enough to convince me that he did it. Anyway, though both Vera and Jacob passed away years ago without ever knowing what happened to their daughter, Sean, however, is alive and well, and he still is searching for clues and for answers to what happened to his mom, even though he was too young to really remember it. There's just something about getting phone calls and threats and stuff before somebody goes missing that's just like extra disturbing to me. Pretty much at this point, since this case is so old, all I can hope is that Dorothy did not suffer, because what she went through was just absolutely awful torment. And the other thing, since this only happened in 1980, it is totally possible that her killer is still out there and connected to other crimes, or we don't know, but it's totally possible that they're still alive. Probably too old to do anything else, but it's still really creepy to think about that whoever did this totally got away with it. Okay, everyone, so that's gonna be it for Dorothy's case. Please let me know what you think down below. A big thank you to my patrons for making this all possible, especially Colin Holmes, Deck of Cards, Creep Me Out, and Alice Paul for signing up for the highest tier. But of course, thank you to everyone on the screen. If you guys could give this video a like just to help the channel out, it would help me a lot. And thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it to the end. I'll see y'all in the next one.